Hi, I'm Dr. Kathleen Montgomery, here with an AverPoint coronavirus update. The winter wave is upon us. On Friday, November 20th, we had nearly 200,000 new cases of coronavirus in the US. That's more than double the peak we had in the spring or summer. But as the winter wave ramps up, we have some really promising news on the vaccine front this week. Today, we're going to talk about where the vaccine trials stand, what's unique about these new vaccines, and what we can expect as far as a time frame for distribution and, thankfully, finally, a return to normal life. Both Pfizer and Moderna announced that their vaccines are about 95% effective at preventing symptomatic coronavirus infection. That's awesome news! That is as effective as many of the vaccines on the market today, and I think better than a lot of us were expecting, given that these are totally new types of vaccines. Furthermore, Pfizer announced that it has already applied for an EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization, and could start distributing the vaccine before the new year if the EUA is approved. We'll talk more about that later, but first, let's break down what we know about the effectiveness of the two vaccines. The studies were randomized, placebo-controlled trials, meaning the companies took a large number of people and randomly gave half the active vaccine and half an injection of placebo. Then they followed them over time to see how many people in each group developed symptomatic coronavirus. They were only tested for coronavirus if they developed symptoms, so we don't yet know how effective the vaccines are at preventing asymptomatic infection or spread. So far, Pfizer has enrolled about 44,000 participants in its trial, and Moderna has enrolled about 30,000. Next, researchers compared the number of cases in the vaccine and placebo groups in order to calculate something called an incidence rate ratio. In Pfizer's case, they had 162 cases of COVID-19 in the placebo group and only 8 cases in the vaccine group. Importantly, 9 of the 10 cases of severe disease occurred in the placebo group, which also shows that the vaccine is effective at preventing severe disease. Using those numbers, they calculated the vaccine efficacy, meaning how good the vaccine is at preventing disease. For Pfizer, it's about 95% effective. Moderna released similarly promising numbers in their study, although their phase 3 trial is not yet complete. Among 30,000 participants, 90 of the first 95 cases occurred in the placebo group, and only 5 in the vaccine group. All 10 severe cases occurred in the placebo group. This makes Moderna's vaccine about 94.4% effective, almost identical to Pfizer's. Neither company has yet released their entire data to the public. Okay, those numbers sound really good. So what are the next steps to get approval and start distributing the vaccines? You might remember from our discussion on antibodies that an EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization, is a way to speed through approval of a new treatment in extenuating circumstances, like a global pandemic. You don't have to have the same safety and efficacy data for an EUA as you do for full FDA approval. You just have to show that your product is safe and probably effective. To get an EUA for a coronavirus vaccine, companies have to have a median of 2 months of follow-up from all participants that received the vaccine. Pfizer has reached that point and submitted for an EUA, which, if granted, would allow the vaccine to start being distributed almost immediately. Moderna will likely have this data by the end of November and will submit an EUA probably sometime in December. If we're lucky, one or both vaccines will have their EUAs approved by the end of this year. So who will be the first to get the vaccine? Pfizer anticipates having enough doses for about 12.5 million Americans by the end of 2020, which is obviously not enough for everyone. The CDC has released a playbook of guidelines for the rollout of vaccination, but who will actually receive the first vaccines will require coordination between local governments and health departments. In the early weeks, the vaccine will likely be limited to those working in healthcare who have direct patient contact or contact with potentially infectious patient samples. Then it will probably be extended to other healthcare workers, people deemed to be at high risk, including people over age 65, and other essential workers. Other critical populations that may receive the vaccine before the general public include high-risk people like teachers, college students, nursing home residents, residents of correctional facilities, and the homeless. If all goes well, vaccines may be widely available to the general public by mid-2021. Once you have access to the vaccine, how will you pay for it? How much will it cost? Really good news here. The CARES Act mandates that private insurances, Medicare, and Medicaid all completely cover the costs associated with vaccination. So for the majority of Americans, it will be entirely free. Okay, we're gonna get a little bit scientific here, so bear with me. There are numerous vaccine candidates in development right now, but approval of either Pfizer or Moderna's vaccine would make headlines around the world because they would be the first mRNA vaccine. Traditional vaccines use proteins or heat-inactivated viruses, but have some drawbacks. They don't always fully activate the immune system, so the resulting immunity is not always robust, and the vaccines may take a long time to produce because they require growing virus in cell culture, which is both time and labor intensive. But mRNA is different. You might remember from biology class that mRNA is the template or script our cells use to make proteins. It's completely separate from DNA. DNA lives in the nucleus, it contains our genes, it's passed down from cell to cell. mRNA is just a molecule that hangs out in the cytoplasm, teaches your cell to make proteins, and then degrades by itself. So this mRNA vaccine would be used by your cells temporarily as a template to create a virus protein. This protein would then activate more components of your immune system than a traditional vaccine would. And they pose no risk of infection because they contain no virus. And unlike some conspiracy theorists would have you believe, they're not capable of changing or integrating into your DNA. mRNA vaccines are also easy to tweak to just the right genetic code and easy to mass produce quickly. Both vaccines require 2 shots about 3 to 4 weeks apart. One thing to note about mRNA vaccines, though, is that they can cause side effects potentially more often than traditional vaccines because they're more effectively activating the immune system. Both Moderna and Pfizer have reported side effects like fatigue, muscle aches, and fever in less than 10% of patients. No deaths have been reported in either study in patients who receive the vaccine. mRNA vaccines offer some advantages over traditional vaccines, but there is one major drawback. mRNA is very unstable at room temperature, and the mRNA-based vaccines need to be stored at extremely cold temperatures at all times during production, transportation, and storage, which in supply chain management is called a cold chain. Pfizer has created temperature-controlled GPS-enabled boxes to transport their vaccines, but widespread distribution will require scaling up of dry ice production and cold-resistant glass production. This could potentially cause another slowdown in vaccine distribution, especially to rural areas. But don't lose hope yet. Several non-mRNA vaccines, which don't require extreme temperature-controlled storage, are in phase 3 trials, including those by Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. It's likely that multiple vaccines will receive an EUA in early 2021, and probably by using a combination of mRNA and non-mRNA technology, vaccines will be available to most Americans by mid-2021. Thanks for joining us for this coronavirus vaccine update, powered and researched by AverPoint and written by me, Dr. Kathleen Montgomery. Please join us in future weeks as my colleague Dr. Larry Burchett will be discussing coronavirus vaccine myths and misconceptions. If you found this video helpful, please share it and interact with more evidence on averpoint.com.